There are stories buried in courthouse ledgers, stories that whisper from the margins of history, stories so carefully concealed that the ink itself seems reluctant to tell them. 4 men of power, an attorney, a banker, a judge, a sheriff, each fell to a violent, unnatural end between 1838 and 1841. On paper, their deaths were accidents, misfortune, the cruel indifference of fate. But look closer, and you will see a pattern, a design. Each man had taken the hand of a bride, and each bride was a sister from the same family. 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 graves. Tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? Write it in the comments, because before this tale is finished, I need to know who among you is truly willing to look into the abyss of Lancaster County's forbidden history. Now listen carefully. What I'm about to reveal is not a ghost story, though there are ghosts here. It is not simply true crime, though there is crime, blood, and betrayal. This is a ritual of survival hidden inside the body of a family, a pact sealed by candlelight in a stone farmhouse when 4 women chose to defy the law, defy society, defy God himself if necessary, all to keep the land whole. Their father had warned them, lose the land, lose your blood, lose your soul, and they believed him. So they bent marriage, widowhood, and inheritance law into weapons, and the men who thought they were wedding wives were instead walking straight into a silent execution. The year is 1836, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The Brennan farm stretched across 847 acres of rich black soil. Wheat grew so thick it seemed like a sea, and the cattle herds thundered like armies. Patrick Brennan, the patriarch, had carved it out of the wilderness with his own hands after fleeing Ireland with nothing but a hatred of landlords and a dream of sovereignty. For 37 years he built an empire, stone barns, silos, pastures that seemed endless. But his wealth brought with it a curse, the laws of Pennsylvania inheritance. With no sons, everything he built would be divided into fragments among his 4 daughters. Land splintered is land lost. He had drilled this terror into them since childhood. The moment you give away the soil beneath your feet, you vanish. And so, when Patrick Brennan died in October of 1836, something far darker than grief settled into that farmhouse. The daughters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, looked at each other across the candlelit kitchen table and saw not sisters but allies in a conspiracy. Bridget, sharp as a lawyer herself, had already been running the accounts. Catherine, born with a gift for reading men's weaknesses like open books. Margaret, angelic in beauty, able to disarm and entrap with a smile. And Sarah, the youngest, quicksilver, adaptable, able to play any role to perfection. 4 pieces of a single weapon. That November night, with frost crawling across the windows and the fire painting their faces in shadow, they spoke the words that damned them. Bridget swore, "We stay together, no matter the cost." Catherine whispered, "The law can be bent." And Sarah, with the cold wisdom of the youngest, breathed the words that sealed 4 fates. Men die, husbands die, widows inherit. Understand this. In 1830s America, women had little claim to power beyond their husbands' names. But the loophole, the narrow opening in the wall of law, was widowhood. A husband dies, and the wife inherits. If 4 husbands were chosen well, the sisters could keep everything. But those men would have to fall in perfect sequence, one by one, with timing so precise, it resembled ritual sacrifice. The first to be chosen was Thomas Hennessy, a prominent attorney, middle-aged, wealthy Catholic, eager for companionship after losing his first wife. He was exact, like the kind of man who would believe that marrying Bridget Brennan was a gift from heaven, not a death sentence. They married in December 1837, and by March of 1838 he was dead, his body broken on the roadside, his horse returning home riderless, foam at its mouth, eyes wide with terror. An accident, they called it. But you're beginning to feel it, aren't you? The unease at the back of your mind, the whisper that says no accident leaves behind a horse trembling like it had seen the devil. You're beginning to sense that this was no tragedy of chance. It was the first step in a plan written not in ink, but in blood. The fog hung heavy that morning, March 15th, 1838, thick enough to choke the road and silence the birds. It was the kind of fog that feels deliberate, as though the world itself was trying to conceal what was about to happen. Thomas Hennessy rode out from the Brennan farmhouse after an argument that would echo in eternity. He had dreamed of Philadelphia, of courts and politics, of leaving behind Lancaster County for the grand stage of ambition. But Bridget would not allow it. She told him, in words that chilled him more than the fog itself, "We do not leave. We do not separate. Ever." Hours later his horse returned, but not him. And when they found him, his neck twisted unnaturally, eyes staring, mouth half open as if he had tried to shout a final word, it was Bridget who played the grieving widow with chilling perfection, tears in public, composure in private. Already she was reviewing his will, already she was securing the trust that kept the land under Brennan control. But the county was blind. Because Lancaster County in the 1830s lived in a haze of politeness and respectability, to suggest that a widow might arrange her husband's death was not only scandalous, it was unthinkable. And so the whispers stayed whispers. The coroner declared it an accident. The priest spoke of God's mysterious plan. The neighbors shook their heads and brought casseroles. And yet, patterns leave traces, and the pattern had only just begun. By the summer of 1838, Catherine Brennan was already walking the polished floors of Hamilton Crawford's bank. Picture him, a man in his late 30s, wealthy beyond the reach of most farmers, his ledgers heavy with mortgages, his vaults heavy with coin. He was a man of precision, of control, the kind who thought numbers never lied. But Catherine knew that numbers could be bent. She came to him at first as a client, discussing her son Esther's finances, pretending vulnerability. But beneath her soft-spoken words was a surgical blade of intent. She told him how dangerous the world was for women alone, how her sisters needed protection. She let him believe he could be their protector. And soon enough, he wanted to be. Crawford fell under her spell. A banker who thought himself immune to manipulation found himself writing her name in the margins of his journals, hearing her voice when he locked his vaults. By October, he was married to her. By February, he was dead, drowned beneath the ice of Mill Creek, his body carried away by water that was supposed to be solid. An accident again. A man too careless on the ice, too eager for a shortcut across the frozen creek. But his final journal entry, the night before his death, still whispers through history. "If something happens to me, look to the sisters. They are not what they seem." Pause, right here. Do you feel it tightening around you? This isn't just about Lancaster. This is about the laws that shape our lives, the invisible cages built around families, inheritance, wealth. And it is about those rare souls who refuse to be caged. The Brennan sisters didn't just inherit land. They inherited their father's hatred of submission. And they weaponized it. But their war was not just against the men they married. It was against the system itself, the system that told them, divide, scatter, vanish. They chose instead to bind, to unite, to conquer. And to accomplish this, they did not need armies, or guns, or open rebellion. They needed only silence, charm, and the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. Understand me. What you are hearing is not the tale of women gone mad with greed. It is the story of four minds that saw through the veil of society and decided to play the game by rules no one dared admit existed. In a world that worshipped law, they fought on the cracks in the law. In a county that believed in marriage, they turned marriage into a battlefield. And Lancaster would never be the same. By the spring of 1839, Lancaster County had already buried two of its most powerful men, an attorney and a banker. Two pillars of law and finance, snuffed out within 11 months of each other, each tied by marriage to the Brennan sisters. Whispers moved through taverns, through church pews, through the market stalls, but no one dared speak them too loudly. The deaths were accidents, tragic coincidences. To suggest otherwise was to accuse women in mourning of cold-blooded conspiracy. Who would believe such a thing? Who wanted to believe it? But Margaret Brennan knew how to turn disbelief into a shield. Unlike Bridget, who relied on intellect, and Catherine, who relied on manipulation, Margaret wielded beauty as her weapon. To Judge Cornelius Whitman, she appeared not as a conspirator, but as an angel draped in sorrow. He was 53, a widower, a man of immense stature in Pennsylvania law. His decisions had determined the fates of farmers and merchants alike. And yet, when Margaret looked at him with wide blue eyes and said she was confused, he felt like a knight summoned to rescue a damsel. She visited his courtroom under the pretense of seeking advice. She claimed she couldn't understand the inheritance statutes, that her family's land was tangled in legal webs beyond her comprehension. Her questions were innocent on the surface, but each was strategically sharp, cutting directly to the points of law that threatened their control of the farm. Whitman answered patiently, unaware he was teaching her how to dismantle him. And Margaret, unlike her sisters, did not push. She lingered. She let silence stretch between her words. She let the judge imagine her vulnerability, and then, slowly, she let him see her strength. She reminded him of his own loneliness, of the wife he had buried 5 years earlier, of the children who had grown distant. She became, in his eyes, the one person who could make him feel alive again. By the summer of 1839, the whispers had shifted. The judge was seen walking with her in the fields, speaking with her after Mass, even attending dinners at the farmhouse. His reputation shielded her from gossip. Who would dare accuse the county's most respected judge of impropriety? By autumn, their engagement was announced. For the third time in as many years, a Brennan sister had captured a man whose wealth, influence, and property would keep the farm intact. But Judge Whitman was not a fool. He was careful, calculating, a man who had spent decades watching litigants twist the law to their own purposes, and though Margaret bewitched him, he sensed an undercurrent he could not name. He wrote to colleagues in Philadelphia about a family of uncommon unity, about a household where sisterly devotion bordered on obsession. He confided to a friend that the farmhouse never felt like a home, but like a fortress. Still, he could not resist. And when the vows were spoken, he stepped willingly into the trap. That winter, 1840, the judge fell ill. Sudden, violent, unexplainable. He complained of burning fever, of weakness that stole his breath. Within days he was bedridden. Within weeks he was dead. The official cause, illness contracted during harvest season, perhaps tainted food, perhaps bad water. Nothing unusual, the doctors said, but those who attended the wake noted that Margaret's tears seemed too precise, too well-timed, as though rehearsed, and the sisters, 3 widows now, stood together at the graveside, not as mourners, but as guardians of a secret victory. 3 men, 3 coffins, 3 inheritances secured. Now pause. Look into the pattern. Do you feel the descent? This was no longer coincidence. This was ritual. Each death was an offering to the same altar, the preservation of blood and land, and the sister, as, with their beauty, their intelligence, their charm, were the priestesses of that altar. The county, however, remained blind, because people prefer the safety of lies over the terror of truth. It is easier to believe in chance than to admit 4 young women could manipulate the very fabric of society. It is easier to believe in accidents than to stare into the face of deliberate survival. But you, listening now, you are not here for the easy answers. You are here to see what others refuse to see. And what comes next will test you even more. By the time Judge Whitman's coffin was lowered into the earth, Lancaster County had shifted from uneasy curiosity to outright awe. 3 sisters, 3 widows, 3 inheritances, all in less than 3 years. To some it was the hand of God, dealing cruel blows of fate. To others it was the silent mark of a curse that clung to the Brennan family like fog to the fields. But no one dared speak the darker thought aloud, that the sisters themselves were the architects of these tragedies. And yet, even with 3 graves behind them, the pact was not complete. One sister remained unbound, Sarah, the youngest. Sarah Brennan was not like Bridget with her cold intelligence, nor Catherine with her strategic charm, nor Margaret with her angelic beauty. Sarah was a chameleon. Her gift was transformation. She could be gentle or fierce, fragile or unyielding, pure or scandalous, whatever the moment required. From the time she was a child, she had learned to mirror the desires of others, to reflect back to them the image they most wanted to see. Where Bridget wielded intellect like a blade, Sarah wielded identity itself. Her turn came in the spring of 1840, when Lancaster's sheriff, John McGovern, was drawn into the sisters' orbit. He was a man of action, not theory. His reputation was one of strength, authority, and discipline. He patrolled with a pistol at his hip and a sense of law in his bones. In a county unsettled by whispers of sudden deaths, he embodied order, the one man people trusted to keep chaos at bay. And yet even a man of order can be undone by a woman who knows exactly how to pierce his armor. Sarah appeared to him at first as innocence itself. She spoke to him of safety, of gratitude for his vigilance, of admiration for his courage. She became the damsel who needed a lawman's shield. But when she saw that his eyes lingered, when she sensed his hunger for more too, hand duty, she shifted. She became passionate, daring, the kind of woman who thrilled a man who had spent too long confined to rigid codes of law. By summer, the sheriff was hers, and with him came not only authority, but power over every whisper of suspicion that still lingered. Who would accuse the Brennan sisters of foul play when the county's sheriff himself was married into their family? Who would dare? The wedding was smaller than the others, less a public celebration than a private coronation. For now, the Brennan sisters had woven themselves into every corner of the county's power structure, law, finance, judiciary, enforcement, all bound to them through rings of gold and vows of love. It was a net cast across Lancaster, and no one even realized they were caught in it. But Sarah's marriage would prove the most dangerous of all, because unlike the others, Sheriff McGovern carried suspicion in his veins. He was not blinded by beauty, nor lulled by words, nor trapped by loneliness. He was a man who lived by evidence, by patterns, by instinct. And though he loved Sarah, though he fell under her spell as the others had, there was a corner of his mind that remained wary. He began to notice the strange unity of the sisters, the way decisions were made collectively, the way grief seemed to weigh less heavily than determination. And then, one October morning in 1841, the sheriff vanished. Days later, his body was discovered at the bottom of his own well, his skull fractured, his body twisted unnaturally by the fall. Another accident, they called it. Perhaps he had slipped in the dark. Perhaps he had leaned too far while drawing water. But those who knew him well whispered that John McGovern was not a man who slipped. 4 men, 4 graves, 4 inheritances secured. And yet, the story does not end here, because behind the silence, behind the official records and the polite funerals, something larger was taking form. The Brennan sisters had not merely defied the law, they had created a new one, their own covenant of blood and survival. A covenant hidden beneath Lancaster's soil, passed through whispers and sealed with death. And now you have heard the opening of it, but we are not finished, not even close. 4 coffins lowered, 4 powerful men gone, 4 young women left standing, not scattered as the law demanded, but bound together stronger than ever. To the eyes of Lancaster County, it was tragedy stacked upon tragedy, but to those who knew how to read patterns, it was something else entirely. A declaration of war. Because understand this, what the Brennan sisters fought was not just poverty, not just the threat of losing land. They were fighting a system older than America itself. Inheritance law was the visible mask of something deeper, a machine of control that demanded families divide, scatter, and weaken across generations. That was how the elite held power, not through the sword, but through the pen, through statutes designed to break bloodlines and force dependency on banks, creditors, and courts. Their father had seen it clearly. He had told them since childhood, lose the land, lose your soul. That wasn't just an Irish farmer's superstition, it was an encoded warning. Land was not dirt, it was autonomy, it was leverage, it was the power to feed yourself, to resist, to stand unbroken. And so the Brennan sisters made a choice that still reverberates like a curse. Better to kill than to scatter, better to write their own law in blood than to obey the written law that stripped them of everything. Think about this. In every empire, from Rome to Britain to America, the most effective weapon has never been the army. It has been the contract, the legal document, the fine print that seems harmless, but that robs men of their freedom across generations. The Brennan sisters saw through it. They saw the hidden blade inside the parchment, and they decided to fight it in the only way women of the time could, by turning marriage into a weapon and widowhood into a crown. This is where the story crosses from history into something darker. Because once you see how the sisters acted, you begin to notice the same pattern everywhere. Land concentrated, then divided. Families shattered, then rebuilt under someone else's name. The cycle repeats, always leaving those in power stronger and those without weaker. The Brennan Pact was not just rebellion, it was revelation. But revelations are dangerous, and they always carry a price. After the sheriff's death in 1841, Lancaster County began to whisper more loudly. 4 sisters, 4 dead husbands, 4 inheritances. Too many coincidences. The coroner swore they were accidents. The priests preached faith in God's mysteries, but men around the county began to fear marrying into the Brennan bloodline. It was as though the sisters had become living omens, women who carried death in their bridal veils. And yet, they kept the land. That was the terrifying truth. Their farmhouse stood, their fields remained whole, their herds untouched. They had done what men, lawyers, and judges had failed to do. They had bent the law until it broke, and still no one could touch them. Here, let me pull you deeper. Ask yourself, why are stories like this buried? Why do we have courthouse records that tell us of accidents but not of patterns? Why do we have parish registers that mention marriages and funerals but omit the whispers of conspiracy? Because history, as it is given to you, is not truth. It is narrative. It is curated memory. And what is curated is always chosen by those who want control. The Brennan sisters saw through it, and by stepping outside the official story, they became shadows. Dangerous, untouchable shadows. But shadows don't remain shadows forever. Patterns demand attention. And in Lancaster, those who whispered too, loudly about the sisters often found themselves silenced, some with ruined reputations, others with vanished fortunes. The Brennan farmhouse became not just a place but a symbol, a fortress where women defied the written order and lived by a darker one. Now pause. Think carefully. If 4 farm women in 1838 could see through the illusions of law and bend it to their will, what illusions surround you right now? What contracts, what systems, what codes of obedience are shaping your life in ways you do not question? What would you do if you could see them clearly? That is why this story matters. It is not just a tale of 4 sisters and 4 deaths. It is a mirror. And if you keep listening, that mirror will turn on you. You've seen the surface, 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 graves. But if you stop at the surface, you miss the true descent. Because what bound the Brennan sisters was not merely circumstance. It was ritual. Picture the farmhouse at night, the lamps extinguished, the shutters drawn tight. No sound but the crackle of firewood and the wind pressing against the wooden boards. In that darkness the sisters gathered, not as widows in mourning, but as guardians of a pact older than their own lives. They sat at the long oak table, the same table where their father once dictated prayers before meals. But instead of prayers, they whispered strategies. Instead of psalms, they recited debts, deeds, and wills. Every document they touched became a weapon. Every decision was weighed not for comfort, but for survival. Bridget, the eldest, always began. Her voice was sharp, commanding, like the strike of a hammer. She framed their reality in terms of law and loopholes. She spoke of what the courts would accept, what the neighbors could be made to believe. Then Catherine followed, weaving her words with the softness of persuasion. How to charm, how to disarm, how to make suspicion dissolve before it took form. Margaret then lent her part. Not strategy, not persuasion, but performance. She practiced gestures, tones of voice, the perfect moment to let tears fall. And Sarah, the youngest, listened. She absorbed. She shifted herself to become the embodiment of whatever was missing. Each sister filled the space the others left open. Together, they formed not 4 lives, but one living organism, something larger than the sum of its parts. Their unity was terrifying, and to maintain it, they created rituals. One of those rituals survives in whispered accounts, the Black Table Supper. After each funeral, the sisters dressed in mourning clothes and ate in silence at the oak table, the only sound the scraping of spoons against bowls. Each would place in the center of the table a single object taken from the deceased husband, a pocket watch, a quill, a sheriff's badge. These tokens were not displayed as keepsakes but as trophies, and once the meal was done, Bridget would speak a single sentence. "His name is ours now." They were not witches. They were not casting spells. But what they did was darker, because it was real. They were binding themselves to power through deliberate acts of memory. They were ensuring that none of them ever forgot the cost or the purpose of what they had done. And in these late-night gatherings, something else began to stir. They stopped referring to themselves as individuals. Letters written by distant relatives reveal the shift. Phrases like, "The sisters have decided," or "The sisters will attend." Never Margaret, never Catherine, never Sarah or Bridget. Only the sisters. A singular entity. A collective mind. It was as though the farmhouse itself had swallowed their names and replaced them with one voice. Now, pause here and consider the psychology. What happens when identity dissolves into unity, when the self no longer exists, but only the pact? In religion, it is called communion. In politics, it is called revolution. In psychology, it is called dissociation. And in the Brennan farmhouse, it became survival incarnate. But survival is never enough. Once you've tasted the power of bending rules, of defying written law and reshaping the world through will alone, you begin to hunger for more. And hunger is what carried the sisters beyond Lancaster, into shadows that stretched far wider than the county lines. Because history tells us the Brennan story ends here, with 4 widows, a preserved farm, and whispers of coincidence. But history lies. The rituals of the farmhouse did not end. They evolved. And soon, they would spree. Dies. If the farmhouse was their fortress, Lancaster was only their testing ground. Once the pact had been proven, 4 husbands gone, 4 inheritances secured, the Brennan sisters looked outward, because power, once tasted, is never content with borders. At first it was subtle. Farmers in neighboring York and Dauphin counties began to note strange visits, Catherine appearing in town meetings, Bridget offering legal advice to cousins, Margaret seen comforting widowers not her own. Sarah drifted between all of them, taking on roles that blurred the lines of kinship. None of these movements were alarming in isolation, but taken together, they formed the early spread of a network. Understand, these women were not trying to build an empire of armies. Their empire was softer, stranger. It worked through bloodlines, marriages, inheritances. They understood something most men of their time did not, that power was not just held in land or money, but in the webs of kinship that determined who survived and who disappeared. One record survives of Bridget writing to a cousin in Harrisburg, "Do not sell the plot. The soil is not for market, it is for blood." That phrase, "for blood," is a key to the Brennan logic. To them, land was not a commodity, but a vessel. To let it pass to strangers was to let their very lifeline be severed. And so they extended their vigilance outward, ensuring cousins and nieces married strategically, ensuring property never slipped from their invisible grasp. But their reach was not only economic, it became cultural. Women whispered of the Brennans in kitchens and churchyards. Some whispered in fear, others in awe. In a world where widows were supposed to fade into quiet dependence, the sisters radiated a different archetype, survival through defiance, their unity, their secrecy, their control over men of stature. It stirred something primal. Folk stories began to coil around them. Children were warned that to cross the Brennans was to invite misfortune. Men joked half nervously that marrying a Brennan was a death sentence, and among women a different whisper emerged, that perhaps the sisters had discovered a kind of freedom no priest could bless and no law could contain. And yet, freedom always has its shadow. By 1843, whispers reached the bishop in Philadelphia, reports of unnatural mourning, of unholy sisterhood, of women who seemed to prosper in the wake of repeated deaths. The church, always alert to threats of heresy, began to take note. Records mention a priest dispatched quietly to counsel the sisters. His name has been lost, but parish notes say he never returned to Lancaster. Coincidence, or another disappearance swallowed by the farmhouse? What we know for certain is this. By the mid-1840s, the Brennan sisters were no longer simply a local story. Their legend was moving through Pennsylvania like smoke. Some called them witches, some called them demons, others more carefully called them guardians, but all agreed on one thing: they were untouchable. And here lies the true descent. Because when power cloaks itself in myth, it no longer needs to hide. The sisters had become not merely widows of Lancaster, but figures of folklore, and folklore is far harder to kill than flesh. Now consider this. Every society buries its dangerous women under labels: witch, temptress, heretic. It is easier to reduce them to symbols than to face what they reveal about the fragility of order. The Brennan sisters revealed something terrifying: that survival was possible outside the sanctioned structures of law, church, and male authority. That revelation was more dangerous than poison. But folklore also carries danger for those it surrounds, because myths spread, but they also mutate. And in the mutation of the Brennan store, new forms of control began to emerge, ones that carried their echo long after the farmhouse was quiet. By the middle of the 1840s, the Brennans had become more than a story. They had become a signal women could recognize in each other, passed in whispers, in gestures, in the coded language of kitchens and sewing circles. Lancaster was only the beginning. In Harrisburg, Reading, York, places just a few hours' ride away, rumors began surfacing of sisterhoods that met in the evenings, away from the eyes of men. Not formal lodges, not written societies, but gatherings bound by the same logic that governed the Brennans: blood before law, unity before obedience, survival before submission. Of course, nothing was ever written down. That was the brilliance of it. Men left paper trails, contracts, records, bylaws. Women left memory, oral networks. A song sung slightly off-key, a phrase inserted into conversation, a way of folding a cloth on the table. These were signals, and those who understood them could move in silence through entire counties, untouched. And everywhere you look in the historical record, you find faint fingerprints. In York County, a farmer's will altered mysteriously in favor of his widow, signed by witnesses who later swore they had no memory of the night. In Harrisburg, a banker's sudden illness after a second marriage, leaving his estate not to distant relatives, but to the widow's sisters. In Lebanon, a priest complaining in a letter that the women grow too close, too unified, as though they answer to each other more than to their husbands. Coincidence, or the slow spread of a hidden covenant? The truth is this: the Brennans had cracked something open. They had revealed that marriage and widowhood were not simply private tragedies, but tools of leverage. And once the pattern was visible, others began to replicate it, quietly, carefully, but with precision. Think of it as a shadow network. Not witches, not criminals, not revolutionaries in the open sense. Something more subtle. Women who knew how to arrange deaths without leaving marks. Women who knew how to bend laws without raising suspicion. Women who placed unity above romance, bloodlines above obedience. And once you begin to see it, the pattern keeps appearing. Here is the descent you must recognize. Power always adapts. When one door is closed, another is forced open. For men in 19th century Pennsylvania, the door of authority was law, church, and property. For women, that door was barred. But the Brennans showed there was another path, through shadow, through silence, through the manipulation of grief, inheritance, and reputation. By the late 1840s, Lancaster men no longer joked about the sisters. They whispered with fear. No family wanted to cross them. No official wanted to provoke them. And so the sisters, without armies or titles, controlled a swath of Pennsylvania through nothing but reputation and ritual. But here's the twist. Reputation cuts both ways. Once you are a myth, you no longer control the story. Others begin to tell it for you, shaping it into warnings, allegories, half-truths. Some said the sisters bathed in the blood of their husbands. Others claimed they poisoned communion wine. Still others swore they were never women at all, but demons wearing human skin. All lies, of course, and yet these lies served a purpose. They masked the truth that was far more terrifying. The sisters were simply human, but united with a clarity and willpower most people never achieve. Now pause here and ask yourself, which is scarier? Witches who fly in the night, or ordinary women who bend entire counties to their will through nothing but unity and precision? The supernatural is comforting because it is unreal. The Brennans were not unreal, and that is what makes them dangerous. Still, because patterns like theirs don't die, they echo. And some of those echoes are closer to you than you want to believe. Every power that rises invites resistance. And yet, when it came to the Brennan sisters, every attempt to expose them, to punish them, to cut them down, collapsed into silence. Consider the first whisper of accusation. It came not from a farmer, not from a rival family, but from within the legal system itself. A young clerk in Lancaster, barely 22, who had read Hamilton Crawford's private journal after the banker's death. The boy told a friend, then another, that Crawford suspected foul play. Soon he was saying it openly. The sisters had engineered not one death, but two. Within weeks, the clerk was gone. Officially, he had left for Baltimore to take work with a shipping firm. Unofficially, neighbors swore they saw him late one night, entering the Brennans' farmhouse with a sheaf of papers under his arm. He was never seen again. His belongings remained in his rented room untouched, as though he had stepped out for an hour and never returned. The coroner who investigated Hennessy's and Crawford's deaths, Dr. Mallister, began to raise quiet doubts as well. He wondered aloud why such skilled horsemen and careful bankers were felled by such common accidents. He questioned why widows moved so quickly to secure estates, why the sisters seemed almost rehearsed in their grief. 6 months later, Mallister himself succumbed to what his peers described as an acute fever. No investigation, no exhumation, a brilliant medical mind erased before his suspicions could solidify. Then came the judge. Cornelius Wittmann, the third husband, was a man not easily silenced. His death from sudden illness was explained by his age. 53 was no small span in that era. But private letters he wrote to colleagues just days before suggest otherwise. In one, Wittmann hinted that the Brennans had ensnared him in a scheme of inheritance that cannot be undone. In another, he wrote, bluntly, "I fear I am next." Those letters vanished from courthouse archives. The only reason we know they existed at all is because a secretary, decades later, mentioned them in her memoirs. By the time her book was published, the Brennans had been dead for years, but the pattern was already clear. Anyone who spoke too loudly was cut down, one way or another. And so fear became the sisters' shield, not fear of daggers in the dark, but fear of reputation. Lancaster men began to whisper, "If you accuse them, you disappear. If you marry them, you die. If you oppose them, your family suffers." The county's social fabric reshaped itself around this terror. Men of standing began avoiding single women connected to the Brennans by blood or by friendship. Priests grew cautious in sermons, careful not to lecture too sternly about women's duties. Even tavern talk, the crude gossip of drunken farmers, grew cautious. To laugh too loudly at the Brennan name was to risk the sudden silence of exile, illness, or accident. That's the power of myth when it fuses with fear. You don't need soldiers, you don't need weapons. All you need is silence, and silence became their fortress. Think about it. How many truths in your own time are kept buried not by force, but by the quiet weight of silence? How many men know something is wrong but never speak, because to speak is to vanish, socially or literally? The Brennan sisters had turned the county into a mirror of your own world, a place where truth was obvious but untouchable, where suspicion existed but never bloomed into action. They revealed a terrifying fact. The best prison isn't iron or stone, it's fear of speaking. And so the legend deepened. The sisters became untouchable not because they were never suspected, but because suspicion itself had become dangerous. That's the descent you must grasp. Once silence sets in, the truth rots underground, and when truth rots underground, it feeds roots that grow even stronger in the dark. We have reached the middle of the labyrinth, and I need you to understand something. If you've come this far, you're no longer just a listener. You're a participant. You are no longer standing at the edge of the Brennan legend. You are inside it, and there is no way back. By now you have seen the pattern. 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 deaths, each one appearing natural, yet each one feeding the same design: unity, survival, power. And you have seen the silence that grew around them, a silence thick enough to choke witnesses and swallow evidence whole. But here is the truth you were never supposed to hear. The sisters did not just protect their land. They created a ritual of control, a living demonstration of how fear, unity, and reputation can bend entire systems without a single law, without a single vote, without a single battle. Do you see it yet? This is bigger than Lancaster, bigger than Pennsylvania. It's a blueprint for how hidden forces control nations, economies, even your own mind. The Brennans were not witches, not demons, not legends. They were the prototype of something that still governs the world today. Think about it. Inheritance laws, banking systems, political offices, every structure you live under was designed to fragment you, to divide loyalty, to scatter bloodlines, to weaken unity. But the sisters refused division. They hacked the system. They inverted it. Where the law said divide, they said bind. Where society said scatter, they said gather. Where priests said submit, they said control. And once you see that inversion, you cannot unsee it. But here's the danger. Every story like this carries a curse, the curse of recognition. Once you understand the pattern, it begins to echo. You'll see it in corporations that demand loyalty above family. You'll see it in governments that silence dissent with accidents and illnesses. You'll see it in elites who feed on division while binding themselves in secret brotherhoods. That's why I need you to do something right now. Not for me, but for yourself. A symbolic act of initiation, to prove that you see the pattern and that you will never again pretend blindness. Go to the comments and write this phrase twice, exactly as I speak it. Silence feeds the roots. Once for recognition, once for transformation. Write it, and you mark yourself as someone who has passed the threshold, someone who will never again be lulled by the lie that accidents are accidents, that power is random, that the past is harmless. You will have joined the current that runs beneath this story, the current the Brennan sisters themselves tapped into. Do it now, and feel the shift, because the truth is not just history. The truth is a weapon. The sisters knew it, and now you know it. But our descent is not finished. Not yet, because there is a final twist in this story, one so dark that even their closest allies refuse to speak of it, a revelation that takes the Brennans from legend into something almost mythic, something that suggests they were not just defending land, but guarding a secret far older, far more dangerous, and far more enduring. We stand on the edge of that abyss now, and if you thought the first half of this story was disturbing, what comes next will change the way you look at family, power, and history itself. You have been warned. You have taken the step. You have written the words, and now the current runs through you, binding you to the descent. What comes next is the part of the story they buried deepest, because it is not simply about inheritance or land. It is about what was buried beneath that land, and why the sisters would kill to protect it. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was not empty when the Brennans arrived. It was Lenape land, stolen and parceled out under colonial law. Long before Patrick Brennan built his empire, that soil was marked with stories, sacred sites, burial grounds, places where treaties were broken and blood was spilled. Hidden inside courthouse records, if you dig far enough, you find references to disputed tracts along Mill Creek, the northern border of the Brennan farm. These disputes weren't about crops or fences, they were about something older. Archaeological reports from the early 1900s mention strange stone alignments, burial mounds that had been quietly plowed under, artifacts that vanished into private collections. And here is the detail no one talks about. Patrick Brennan paid double the going rate for the land that bordered Mill Creek. Double. Why? What did he see, or what was he told, that made him determined to keep that ground intact at all costs? Now tie this to the sisters. Their father had drilled into them. Land is not dirt, it is blood. Lose the land, lose yourself. At the surface, that sounds like the cry of any Irish exile. But what if it meant something more? What if Patrick knew that beneath his soil lay power, or at least the memory of power, that could never be divided without destroying everything? Look at the pattern again. Every husband's death occurred after he began questioning, after he grew too curious, after he pressed too close to the edges of the Brennan women's unity. Could it be that the sisters were not just defending inheritance law, but defending a secret older than the law itself? A Jesuit missionary writing in 1832 complained that Irish settlers in Lancaster cling to the land as though it were their shrine, refusing to allow its division even under God's law. That's a strange phrase, isn't it? A shrine. What shrine? What sacred center? And why were the Brennans the only family in Lancaster to guard their borders so violently, even before the deaths began? Some local stories claim that at night along Mill Creek you could hear voices, not the voices of the sisters, but of something older carried on the water. Others claimed that no matter how bad the drought, no matter how harsh the winter, the Brennan soil remained unnaturally fertile, as if the land itself was feeding them, sustaining them. Do you see the shape forming? This was not simply about greed or ambition. This was guardianship. The sisters were holding something, protecting it, perhaps even feeding it. And here's the shadow that creeps closer. Power always has a price. Every death, every silence, every accident may have been more than strategy. It may have been sacrifice, a way to bind the land, to keep its fertility, its secret strength intact for the bloodline. That is why they refused separation. That is why they killed together, because what they guarded could not survive division. Now ask yourself, what secret would make 4 women risk everything, commit crimes in plain sight, and shroud themselves in fear and myth to preserve it? The answer lies not just in Lancaster, but in every empire, every dynasty, every hidden cult that has ever walked this earth. The land remembers, and those who guard it will do anything to keep its memory intact. You have seen the surface story, the land, the inheritance, the accidents, but beneath that surface runs something far more disturbing, and this is where the whispers grow louder, where the Brennans are no longer seen as grieving widows or cunning strategists, but as something darker, keepers of a ritual. Think carefully about the timing of the deaths. None were random. Each occurred at precise intervals, never chaotic, always measured. Hennessy in March of 1838, Crawford in February of 1839, Whitman in the autumn harvest of 1840, the sheriff in 1841, at the turning of the season, 1 year after another, almost like offerings laid at the feet of time itself. Is it coincidence that each husband was not only wealthy and powerful, but also deeply entangled with the machinery of law, money, and control? If this was simply about survival, 1 death might have been enough. But 4, across 4 years, each tethered to cycles of season and estate, suggests more than strategy. It suggests ritual. There are scattered accounts, small, easily dismissed, but impossible to ignore once you've seen the pattern. A midwife's diary, written in shaky script, describing how she was turned away at the Brennan house during a birth that was not a birth. A farmhand who claimed he saw the sisters at midnight, standing barefoot in the fields, hands linked in a circle while the creek rose higher than the moon. A traveling preacher who refused to stay the night on Brennan land, writing later that their house smelled not of bread and firewood, but of iron and blood. What if these deaths were not accidents at all, not even murders in the ordinary sense, but sacrifices? Each husband brought wealth, influence, and legal restructuring that strengthened the sisters' control over the land, but perhaps that was only part of their purpose. Perhaps each man was an offering bound into the soil it sustained, ensuring the land remained whole and fertile, ensuring the sisters' bond was sealed not just by bloodline, but by blood spilled. If you think this is too far, look closer at history. Ancient families have always guarded their wealth through sacrifice. Kings buried alive with servants, pharaohs entombed with wives, Celtic chieftains laid to rest with warriors bound at their feet. Why would Lancaster be different? Why would 1838 be immune to the echoes of ancient rituals? The Brennan sisters, 4 Irish daughters of exile, carried with them not only the trauma of their father's eviction from Irish land, but the memory of old stories, old ways. Ireland itself was steeped in myths of blood-soaked fields, of land that demanded offering, of sovereignty goddesses who required death before granting fertility. Do you think those stories died on the voyage across the Atlantic? Or do you think Patrick Brennan told them by firelight, as his daughters listened and learned? Now think again about Sarah's words on that November night after their father's death. Men die, sisters. Husbands die, and widows inherit everything. That wasn't just cynicism. That was invocation, a declaration of ritual, and Lancaster County became their altar. But here is the true darkness. If these deaths were sacrifices, then the sisters were not simply feeding themselves. They were feeding the land, keeping it fertile, binding it with death so it could sustain life. And that cycle, once begun, does not end. It echoes, it demands repetition. Which means the Brennans were not merely farmers, not merely killers. They were priestesses of a hidden ritual, cloaked in respectability, masked by tragedy, feeding an altar that wore the disguise of a farm. And that altar still stands. By now you see it. The Brennan sisters were not simply clever widows or unlucky wives. They had bound themselves to a ritual, and Lancaster County itself had become their altar. But here's the question that matters. How did they survive it? How did they avoid the gallows, the prison, the noose? How did 4 women, rumored to be murderesses and witches, continue to walk openly through the markets and churches of Lancaster without chains on their wrists? The answer is chilling. Lancaster's institutions became complicit. Let us start with the church. Priests had power in this era: confession, community, control of rumor. And yet, not a single sermon denounced the Brennans by name. Why? A visiting minister once wrote that he felt watched during Mass when the sisters sat in the front pew, as though their very presence silenced his tongue. Others whispered that the parish feared them, not for scandal, but for curse. That to condemn the sisters was to invite blight on one's crops, sickness in one's children, ruin in one's house. And so the pulpits stayed silent. Now the courts. By rights, the sisters should have stood trial. 4 dead men, each leaving behind land or wealth funneled into their hands. And yet records vanish. Inquest notes disappear. Testimonies go missing. Clerks resign, lawyers withdraw, and judges quietly reassign themselves when Brennan cases arrive on their desks. Do you believe all of this was incompetence, or is it more likely that Lancaster's legal system understood something unspoken, better to lose a few files than to risk the wrath of women who walked with death at their side? Even the newspapers, usually so eager for scandal, treaded carefully. One obituary after another praised the tragedy of widowed Brennan women, never hinting at foul play. The Lancaster Gazette printed a curious editorial in 1841, just after Sheriff Collins died. There, "Our forces in this county best left unnamed. Let us not stir shadows when the harvest depends on sun." What kind of newspaper writes that, unless it too had bowed to silence? And this is where the myth and the political fuse. Fear of scandal may have played a part, but deeper still was fear of contagion. The idea that if you crossed the sisters, something would happen to you. A sickness, a loss, a disappearance. Enough examples had already piled up. Dr. Mallister, the clerk, the judge, that Lancaster's leaders learned the lesson: do not touch the Brennans. This silence was not passive. It became active protection. Sheriffs lost warrants, priests redirected gossip, bankers smoothed transactions, all of it justified in whispers. Better the sisters are left alone than the county cursed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Once silence hardens into complicity, it becomes indistinguishable from ritual. Lancaster itself, its institutions and leaders, had become participants in the Brennan cult, whether they admitted it or not. Each missing file, each unsaid sermon, each quieted rumor was an offering laid at the sisters' feet. Do you see the genius? The sisters didn't need swords or spells. They weaponized silence, and the silence became worship. Not worship of God, not worship of law, worship of fear. And fear, once enthroned, sustains itself. So when people ask, why didn't anyone stop them? The real answer is this: Everyone did stop them. Every priest, every judge, every sheriff stopped themselves. The sisters didn't have to enforce the ritual, the county enforced it for them. Which means Lancaster wasn't just the stage of their story. Lancaster was their congregation. And in that congregation, silence was the liturgy. By now you've seen how the Brennan sisters used silence as a weapon, how Lancaster itself bent into complicity, how ritual fed their land and their legend. But here's the question that should haunt you. What happened when they died? Did the ritual end, or did it seed itself into something larger, something that still breathes beneath your feet? Because the records are incomplete, deliberately so. Parish ledgers list deaths, but the Brennans' entries are curiously vague. No exact dates, no illnesses recorded, just lines that read, "Sister Brennan departed this life," as if the parish itself was too afraid to describe the circumstances. There are no marked graves, none. For women of their wealth, this is unthinkable. Even paupers were given stones, wooden markers, something. But the sisters? Nothing but whispers of private burials on their land. Some locals claim the farm's soil itself swallowed them, that their bodies were never coffined, only folded back into the earth they had guarded. And yet, their legacy didn't vanish. It multiplied. By the 1860s, Lancaster's property maps show an odd pattern. Parcels of land supposedly divided after the sisters' deaths remain strangely entangled. Widows and cousins inherit, only to remarry within interconnected families. Sales are recorded, then reversed. Over and over, the paper trail insists on division, but the soil itself seems never to leave the extended Brennan web. It's as if invisible hands were still binding the land together, decades after the sisters' disappearance. Then there are the bloodlines. In the genealogical charts of Lancaster, you see surnames branching and recombining in unnatural ways. Cousins marrying cousins, nieces inheriting, only to fold back into Brennan kin through marriage. By the third generation, outsiders joked that Brennan blood was thicker than the Susquehanna, but was it really a Joe K? Or was it evidence that the ritual of unity, the vow never to let land or lineage divide, continued long after the sisters were gone? And here's where the whispers grow darker. Into the late 19th century, Lancaster's farmers spoke of the Brennan luck, a fertility of soil, a resilience of crops, an uncanny ability to avoid blight that struck neighboring farms. Even when drought shriveled wheat across the county, Brennan-linked fields thrived. Some said it was better irrigation, others said it was better blood. Still others muttered that the sisters were not dead at all, only sleeping in the land. But the most unsettling whispers are the ones that cross time. Families today in Lancaster still tell children, "Don't wander near Mill Creek at night, or the Brennan women will take you." Some dismiss this as a ghost story, a campfire tale, but think about it. How does a story endure for nearly 2 centuries unless something sustains it? Legends die unless they feed on truth. And the truth is this: the Brennans' ritual wasn't about their lifetimes. It was about continuity. About binding themselves to the land so completely that their deaths were irrelevant. The sisters may be gone, but their system, unity through blood, silence through fear, fertility through sacrifice, still pulses beneath Lancaster's history. Ask yourself, how many families in your own community guard land this fiercely? How many bloodlines are coincidentally intertwined, generation after generation? How many local legends warn children away from places where wealth never seems to fade, where fields never seem to fail? These aren't accidents, these are echoes. And echoes mean the ritual isn't finished, it has only changed its shape. So when you walk past a field that seems too green, too alive, when you hear of families whose fortunes never falter, remember this: some roots feed not on water, not on sunlight, but on silence and sacrifice, and the Brennan sisters may have shown the world how it's done. Until now, we've kept our eyes on Lancaster, on the Brennans, on the soil they bound to themselves through silence and sacrifice, but if you think this story ends there, you're missing the deeper pattern. Because what the sisters did in a Pennsylvania county was not unique, it was a mirror, a local reflection of a system that stretches across history, across continents, across dynasties. Look closer, and you'll see the same logic everywhere. Unity of blood, secrecy of power, and sacrifice to preserve continuity. Think of Europe's great houses. The Habsburgs, who intermarried for centuries, folding cousin into cousin until their bloodlines nearly collapsed. Why? To keep wealth and empire intact. Think of the Rothschilds, ensuring marriages stayed within their clan to preserve banking empires across nations. Think of the Medicis, who embedded themselves in papal thrones and royal courts, not through brute force, but through family binding, marriage weaving, and silence. Is this not the same strategy the Brennans enacted, only stripped of its palaces and gold? Their farm was their castle, their rituals were their treaties, their silence was their diplomacy. Now push further east. Ancient dynasties in China bound themselves to the mandate of heaven, their rule justified by fertility of the land. Pharaohs in Egypt claimed their bloodline itself was divine, their deaths synchronized with offerings to gods who kept the Nile flooding. In each case, power was never about individuals, it was about continuity. The body was expendable, the bloodline was not. That's the truth the Brennans grasped, whether consciously or instinctively. Men die, but the line must endure, land must endure, silence must endure. And what of sacrifice? Do you think it belongs only to ancient pyramids or forgotten stone circles? No, every modern system still demands offerings. Wars are fought not to end, but to sustain economies. Young men are sent to battlefields so empires may live. Debt itself is a ritual sacrifice, families offering lifetimes of labor to feed systems that never die. The altar simply changes shape. So when you hear the story of the Brennan sisters, don't dismiss it as a rural curiosity, a morbid bit of folklore. See it for what it is, a prototype. They were not outliers. They were a small-scale reflection of the same machinery that rules the world. The difference is that their ritual was naked, obvious, close enough for neighbors to glimpse. 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 deaths. Everyone saw the pattern, but fear turned sight into silence. That is the only reason they were remembered as witches or monsters, rather than as what they truly were, participants in an ancient order that predates every government you know. And here is the detail that should unsettle you most. Systems like this do not die, they adapt. They hide inside corporations, foundations, bloodline marriages, political dynasties. They move from farmland to boardroom, from creekside ritual to global finance. And they are always cloaked in the same tools: unity of blood, silence of dissent, sacrifice of outsiders. The Brennans were not merely sisters. They were symbols, proof that even on the edge of the American frontier, without castles or crowns, the old pattern still breathed. It does not need palaces, it does not need thrones, it only needs silence, and silence is the easiest thing to grow. So ask yourself, when you look at the families that never lose their wealth, the names that never leave power, the dynasties that reappear generation after generation, are you seeing fortune, or are you seeing ritual? Because Lancaster was only one altar, the world itself is covered in them. By now, Lancaster whispered, not aloud, never aloud, but in sidelong glances, in unfinished sentences, in church pews where neighbors stared too long. 4 weddings, 2 funerals. Always the Brennans at the center, always the farm growing stronger while men around them withered. But if the town suspected, they feared something deeper than scandal. It wasn't just that husbands died, it was how the sisters remained untouched. No grief that lingered too long, no hint of poverty, no disruption of unity. They seemed untouchable. And here's where the darkness sharpens, because power built on sacrifice doesn't simply consume outsiders. Eventually it demands something within. Whispers suggest that the sisters' pact was not just about keeping men from dividing them, but about binding themselves in ways Lancaster would never understand. One diary fragment found decades later, scrawled in faded ink and attributed to Sarah, the youngest, the most impressionable, spoke of a night in late autumn. We swore in the dark, blood on stone, that no man would come between us. That if the day came one of us faltered, the others would hold her to her word, even if her voice begged for mercy. No historian can prove the truth of this, but think, why was Sarah, the youngest, the gentlest, the one who spoke of singing and laughter, suddenly absent from records after 1841? Why, when the sheriff himself was found drowned in his own well, do documents show only 3 sisters appearing at the inquest? The silence around Sarah is the darkest silence of all. Did the pact turn inward? Did the farm demand not only husbands, but one of its daughters as proof? Remember, sacrifice never stops at the boundary you set. Sooner or later, the circle closes. The sheriff of Lancaster County, Elias Morton, was not a man easily shaken. He had faced debtors' riots, land disputes that turned violent, and the occasional drunken brawl that ended in blood. But by 1841, whispers of the Brennan sisters had reached his desk too many times to ignore. 4 weddings, 3 deaths, men of wealth, influence, and respect, each bound to the sisters, each buried too soon. Neighbors spoke only in hushed tones, yet Morton took note. He began asking quiet questions about finances, about wills, about conversations overheard in kitchens and taverns. He visited the Brennan farm more than once, each time noting how the women presented a unified wall of politeness, charm, and silence. He confided to a deputy one chilling line: "They smile too easily, and they never smile at the same time." Then came the spring of 1841. Morton failed to appear at the courthouse for 2 consecutive mornings. A deputy sent to his home found the door ajar, papers scattered across his desk as if he'd been working late, but the man himself was missing. The search ended at his own property well. His body was found submerged, twisted unnaturally, as though he had fallen or been pushed. The coroner declared it an accident. Perhaps he had leaned too far, perhaps a rung of the ladder broke, but those who knew Morton scoffed. The man was careful, meticulous, never careless around danger. At the inquest, 3 sisters appeared: Bridget, Catherine, Margaret. They wore black, though none were widows this time. Sarah was absent. No explanation was offered. The community murmured, but the official verdict was sealed: death by misadventure. Case closed. Yet in taverns and kitchens, the truth spread like smoke. Lancaster was under a spell, and no one dared break it. After the sheriff's death, Lancaster changed. Fear no longer whispered in shadows. It lived in every eye that looked toward the Brennan farm. No one confronted them directly. No one accused them aloud. But in silence, the county decided these women were untouchable. And with that unspoken conclusion, the sisters became something larger than flesh and bone. They became myth. Farmers crossing Mill Creek would make the sign of the cross when they saw the stone house on the hill. Children dared each other to approach the lane, swearing they heard singing in the fields when no one was there. Hired hands who worked a season on the Brennan land claimed the sisters never aged, their faces smooth, their eyes sharper with each passing year. Merchants in town began to refer to them only as the widows, as though their names no longer mattered. In church, people avoided their pew, glancing down at hymnals whenever one of them passed. But here lies the paradox. Fear did not isolate them. It protected them. No one moved against them. No man sought to challenge their hold on the farm. No magistrate dared reopen the deaths. Lancaster turned inward, convincing itself that silence was safer than truth. And so the Brennans thrived. Year after year, their land yielded more harvest than neighbors. Their cattle were fat when others starved in drought. Their accounts at the bank never faltered. And every autumn, on the anniversary of their father's death, lanterns glowed in their windows long past midnight. No one asked why. The pattern was complete. Silence fed power. Power fed survival. Survival fed legend. And as the years turned, the Brennans no longer needed to kill. Fear itself did their work for them. By now you see it, don't you? Lancaster was never just Lancaster. The Brennans were not just 4 sisters on a farm. Their story is a parable, a blood-soaked reminder of how power preserves itself when law, morality, and even God seem inconvenient. Strip away the superstition, and what remains? 4 women bound by an oath who understood that land was life, that property was survival, that unity, even if forged in blood, was more powerful than the shifting loyalties of husbands, neighbors, or lawmen. Is this not the blueprint of every dynasty you've ever heard of? Families who never fall because they've learned the secret. Never let outsiders divide you. Never allow law or custom to scatter your inheritance. And if someone threatens that unity, silence them. quietly, permanently. The Brennans were not monsters, they were mirrors. Their actions echo the same forces that move kingdoms, corporations, and empires today. Why do you think the same surnames appear in power generation after generation? Why do presidents come from the same bloodlines, bankers from the same dynasties, actors and moguls from the same networks of marriage? It is not luck. It is not chance. It is the same oath whispered in kitchens and boardrooms. We stay together, whatever it takes. This is the forbidden history you were never meant to see. That the line between Lancaster farmwives and global elites is not as wide as you were taught. Both understand the same law. Blood binds tighter than justice, silence lasts longer than outrage, and power belongs to those who dare to claim it. The Brennan's altar was a Pennsylvania farmhouse. Today, it is global. And here's the final descent. Once you recognize the pattern, you can never unsee it. You've walked with me through Lancaster's shadows. You've seen the sisters bind themselves in silence, sacrifice husbands, and bend a community into fear. You've seen how a farmhouse becomes a fortress, how myth becomes power, how death itself becomes currency. But now the question turns on you. What do you do with this knowledge? You can dismiss it as old folklore, as nothing more than the dark gossip of 19th century Pennsylvania. You can retreat into comfort, telling yourself this was then, that the world today is safer, kinder, governed by law. But deep down, you know better. The pattern hasn't died, it never dies, it simply changes masks. The Brennans were not witches, they were not anomalies. They were early students of the same code that still rules nations and corporations. Silence, unity, sacrifice, the law of survival, the law of power. And now, you must decide if you will remain blind or if you will let this knowledge burn a new mark into you, because once you see how the world really operates, you cannot go back. So here is the test. Write this phrase twice in the comments to prove you've crossed the threshold. I see the pattern. I will not be divided. That phrase will mark you. It will separate you from those still asleep, from those who laugh at secrets but live as pawns. It will anchor you to a brotherhood of men who refuse silence, who choose sight over comfort. The Brennans built their legacy with blood and fear. You do not need to, but you do need to understand the system they revealed, a system still alive in every capital, every bank, every dynasty. Now the choice is yours. Stay blind, or claim the sight they left behind.